Iranian President Hassan Rouhani announced the end of the Islamic State this week, raising new questions about what's next in this troubled region. And artworks will be swapped between the Vatican Museum and the Forbidden City Palace Museum in Beijing. Will the artworks prepare the canvas for the future of political ties? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani announced the end of the Islamic State in an address broadcast live on state TV this week. Russian President Vladimir Putin also made that declaration during a joint presser after meeting his Iranian and Turkish counterparts in Sochi on Wednesday. Putin said that the large-scale military operations against terrorist groups in Syria are coming to an end. He added that the joint efforts by the three countries, meaning Russia, Iran and Turkey, have effectively saved Syria from disintegration and its capture by the jihadists and the humanitarian disaster that would have accompanied that eventuality. Has the Islamic State truly been rooted out? How will the announcement change the power dynamics in the region in the post-IS period? Joining me from Tehran is Professor Hamed Mousavi from the University of Tehran. Professor Mousavi, welcome to the show. Now, while Iran, Iraq, Syria and Russia are announcing the final defeat of Islamic State in that part of the world, other major players have not openly come to the same conclusion. On what basis was this conclusion made?
Yes, so I mean, the fight against ISIS or the Islamic State has come a long way. It's good to note that at the height of ISIS's power, they were controlling more than 30% of Iraq and more than 40% of Syria. Actually, at its height, ISIS ruled over 8 million civilians. So, and that is a very far difference from their status today. I mean, today they are not controlling any major city in Syria or in Iraq. The last towns they were controlling was Rawa in northern Iraq, near the Iraq-Syrian border, and they were defeated there. Also, they were defeated in Abu Kamal in the south of Syria, again near the Syrian-Iraqi border, but on the Syrian side. So today, ISIS is no longer controlling any major city in Syria and Iraq, and that is a major change. And I think we can say that ISIS as a government is over. Nevertheless, I think ISIS as a terrorist group is not over. I mean, even though they are not controlling any major territory in Iraq and Syria, nevertheless, they still have terrorist cells in European countries as well as in Syria and Iraq. And also they still have their media empire and their propaganda. And most important of all is the ideology of ISIS is still alive.
Right.
So ISIS as a government, yes, it is over, but ISIS as a terrorist group, not yet. We'll
talk about that in just a moment, but why do you think, and by the way, we're joined from Tel Aviv by Mayor Javden Far, our old friend and the Middle East affairs analyst. Mayor, welcome to the show. From your understanding, do you agree with the conclusion that the IS has been defeated? And if so, what does that mean for the war in Syria and for the uncertainty in Iraq as well?
I completely agree with Professor Mousavi's description of ISIS being ISIS, the period of ISIS ruling over territory has ended. That's correct, I agree. But I think what should concern all the countries in the region is that something like 5,600 ISIS terrorists have gone back to their countries of origin. We're looking at estimates here, 900 terrorists have gone back to Turkey, a country which is involved now in the talks in Sochi. We have 700 who've gone back to Saudi Arabia, 400 gone back to Russia. In the UK, there's 400 ISIS terrorists who've returned there, and that's an estimate, and nobody exactly knows where they are. And Belgium, 102, and these are the estimates. And you know, these are countries that will continue to face very strong ISIS presence and threats, and countries such as Tunisia, which emerged out of the Arab Spring. They were basically that's the startup nation when it comes to the Arab Spring, and now the 800 ISIS terrorists have gone back there, and they could cause great damage. So yes, on the one hand, the issue of ISIS as a state is finished, but on the other, the ISIS as a terrorist entity remains. And if I can just finish with the last point, one of the issues that attracted people to ISIS in those countries with the locals was the drought in Iraq, and then the drought in Syria. Unfortunately, the problem of drought in this region remains, and it's only going to get worse, which means that we will continue to face ecological instability in this region for the foreseeable future.
Professor Mousavi, what is your take on Mr. Javdanfar's answer, especially the emphasis on the ecological factor behind the promulgation of the ideology of IS?
Yes, so first of all, I think it is very true that these ISIS fighters going back to their countries is actually going to create a lot of problems for these countries, and perhaps also because ISIS is no longer controlling any territories, it might actually put its effort into more terrorist operations. So I think in the future, I think we are actually going to perhaps see even more terrorist operations by ISIS. Nevertheless, aside from the problem of the drought, it's important to point out that before ISIS lost control of the territory it had in Syria and in Iraq, it lost control of its income. ISIS exported a lot of oil, it sold a lot of oil in the black market, and that's where the source of its revenues were. After this source basically dried up, it was no longer able to pay many of its fighters, and with the economic situation in both Iraq and Syria becoming worse by the day, essentially ISIS was no longer viable economically as well as politically and militarily. Nevertheless, as pointed out, I don't think they will be defeated anytime soon, and I think the main issue here is their ideology. ISIS had a very extremist Wahhabi ideology that has actually not gone away. And if on the ideological front they are not defeated, then we will continue, unfortunately, to see terrorist operations as we have seen in the past few years.
Mm-hmm. My question also to Professor Mousavi, why do you think Iranian President Rouhani would become the first, or would want to come out as early as he can to make this announcement? What is his consideration?
I think one factor is the Iranian rivalry with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is taking very aggressive moves against Iran in the region, and by announcing the defeat of ISIS, essentially Iran is trying to say that we are the ones fighting ISIS in both Iraq and Syria, whereas Saudi Arabia, even though it's accusing Iran of spreading terrorism, Iran is saying, no, it is actually Saudi Arabia with its extreme ideology that is the source of this the ideology of ISIS. So Iran is trying to say we are at the forefront of fighting terrorism in the region. And this was at the same time when the Arab League was discussing a proposal denouncing Iran. So the timing was important as well.
Mr. Javdanfar, let's talk a little bit about the response from the United States. Right now, there is no official response from the White House, but during a press conference early November, U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis said as long as Washington is not convinced that the Syrian political process is moving in the right direction, the United States will not leave Syria. How do you interpret Washington's stance on this? And now that this announcement has been made by Iran and by Russia and Turkey, do you think the United States might come up with something new?
That's a very important question to ask, and the answer is that we don't know. There's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to President Trump's Middle Eastern policy. There's some people who wonder if even if he has a coherent Middle Eastern policy, there's a concern that everything's done haphazardly. For now, it seems that President Trump is counting on the alliance of the United States with some of the Kurdish groups in Syria who have been a key in the war against ISIS, especially groups such as YPG. in terms of fighting ISIS, in terms of taking over some of the strongholds of ISIS. That has been one of the staunchest allies of the United States in Syria. There are also some other Syrian opposition movements such as the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, who are also allies of the United States. It seems that America doesn't want to give up this small influence that it has when it comes to Syria, but at the same time it doesn't want to become too involved because for various reasons. On the one hand, Syria is a very, very difficult case, but on another angle, the Americans seem to be operating on the old adage that if you broke it, you have to pay for it, and they believe that it was the Russians and the Iranians who broke Syria by backing Bashar al-Assad. That's their view, and that they should pay for the reconstruction of Syria. So there's this concern that if America becomes more involved in Syria, it will be asked to contribute to the reconstruction of that country, which something that the United States nor any other country is really interested in. Perhaps maybe with the exception of Iran and Russia, and we're not sure, because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being needed for the reconstruction of Syria in the post-war era.
Mr. Mousavi, your take on this question? I would say right now it is also the opportunity to jump in and to be in part of the rebuilding, reconstruction process as early as possible. What is your take on this?
I think it's worth noting that, first of all, this entire mess in the Middle East was created as a result of the Iraqi invasion of 2003 that led to the rise of extremist groups, first in Iraq, and then it spread to Syria and also to other countries such as Libya. So the United States is actually responsible to a large degree for this mess. And even when ISIS was forming, the United States at the very least did not do anything to prevent it. You might recall that in 2012, Michael Flynn, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, actually said in live TV that we are somewhat responsible for the creation of ISIS. And this is something that was repeatedly mentioned by Donald Trump in the campaign. I think the United States in the fight against ISIS is picking and choosing its fights. So even though, for example, they are fighting ISIS in Libya, in Syria they have a much more complicated strategy. For example, the YPG, that the US ally Kurds fighting in Syria that recently took over the town of Raqqa, actually just 2 weeks ago it was revealed that when they led a siege against the city, they made a deal with ISIS which actually allowed ISIS fighters to leave Raqqa. And nobody actually knows where these fighters are right now, and perhaps they have spread to Syria. So I think the US strategy in the fight against ISIS is more complicated. And I think one concern there is that if ISIS is completely defeated and totally defeated, that is actually going to lead to the rise in the power of Iran. And that's actually something that was mentioned by Henry Kissinger, that the total defeat of ISIS would actually allow Iran to influence the region further. So I think the US strategy is very complicated in the fight against terrorism.
Professor Mousavi, thank you very much. And Professor Hamed Mousavi from the University of Tehran, and May Javdenfar, a Middle East analyst based in Tel Aviv. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. And you're watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us.
This is CGTN.
You're watching CGTN. I'm Jeff Moody, live in Beijing.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from Washington, D.C.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from my room.
I'm members of
Mark, what can you tell us about events happening there?
Politics
This is a pretty picture. Time you can see a band.
Back over to Beijing.
To go after them.
All about
This is CGTN. CGTN. See the difference.
China and the Vatican have announced a first-ever exchange of artworks for exhibits as part of efforts to bolster people-to-people ties. The swap, involving 40 works of art from each side, is due to open simultaneously next March in the Palace Museum inside the Forbidden City in Beijing and the Vatican's Ethnological Museum. Now, China and the Vatican severed diplomatic ties in 1951, and attempts have been made to rebuild relations in the past years. The swap of artworks has been described as art diplomacy. So how has this been made possible, and can we expect more to come in the near future? Joining me from Rome are Francesco Sisci at the Center for European Studies of China's Renmin University, and Jacopo Scaramuzzi, a journalist at Asca News and Vatican insider of the newspaper La Stampa. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Francesco, you were the first journalist to ask the Pope about China. Now, upon hearing this story, what was your first reaction?
Well, it was a great hope, and I think the Pope, I haven't talked to him, of course, but I think he was thrilled because this is a kind of new ping-pong diplomacy. Of course, now this is not sport, but it's art which is playing before our eyes, and this is more beautiful in a way, and it can build a quick bridge. And I think this could pave the way for a normalization of ties between the Holy See and China, or at least so I think they hope people in Rome.
Mr. Scaramuzzi, tell us a bit more about the details of this project, if you can. I mean, what has made this swap possible? Whose idea was this? Do we know?
Well, we don't know exactly, although, of course, the Vatican museums are the museums of the Pope. Of course, they have a sort of autonomy in their administration, but this exchange wouldn't be possible without the support or even the push of the Pope. What we know is that the artworks coming from the Vatican will come from Anima Mundi, which is the ethnological collection within the Vatican museums. There are, from centuries, artwork coming from all over the world, because the Catholic Church had and have relationship with every continent since centuries. So there will be also some Chinese artworks who are now in the Vatican Museum coming back in some way to China. That underlines that the Catholic Church has a will to respect and to understand other cultures since centuries, but with this Pope, this kind of interest and of respect is accelerating in some way.
Mm-hmm. Francesco, tell us a bit about Chinese people's expectations possibly towards artworks coming from the Vatican. How would you think will be the response of the general public, especially when we talk about artworks such as Anima Mundi, which is ancient Chinese art collection, and also some works by Chinese painters? How do you think the Chinese public will be reacting to this?
Well, they will be, I think, very curious, very interested, because these are artworks which have been kept and preserved, very well preserved in Rome and treasured in Rome. So to be returned in a way to China will give the Chinese people a sign of the love and the respect of the Catholic Church towards Chinese culture, is to see, is in a way you know better than me, Chinese people love to read about China in foreign newspapers. This is like looking at Chinese relics in foreign museums. This could be very interesting, and the timing, I think, is also could be very important, because this exhibition will happen at the same time of the plenary session of the National People's Congress, which will open in March. So it will be also an occasion for the 3,000 most important people of China to have a look at this. And this is also an occasion for the Chinese leaders to show to China and to the whole people their determination in engaging the Holy See, I think.
Indeed, the organizer in the Chinese side for this art exchange is the China Cultural Industrial Investment Fund, and the General Secretary Zhu Jiangcheng is reported to have said the event is very important to promote mutual understanding and mutual trust. It will strengthen friendship and promote the normalization of diplomatic relations between China and the Vatican. Mr. Scaramuzzi, how do you look at this message, and how is it perceived on your side about the willingness on the side of China to continue to explore the possibility of normalization of relations?
I think this is an important point for this Pope to have better relations with China. It is not the first Pope who tries to mend ties with China, but I think he is the right man to accelerate this process. John Paul II was willing to ameliorate relationships with China, but he came from Poland and he struggled against communism, so in some way his diplomatic challenge was not the right way to put the question. Then came Pope Benedict XVI, who wrote a very interesting and respectful letter to the Chinese Catholics, but he had two, in my opinion, two weak points. First of all, he was not so much focused on diplomacy, on political, on international politics. And second, under his papacy, the hardliners who are in the Vatican, who don't like the dialogue with other cultures and with China especially, had raised their voices. Now, this Pope can make the difference because he comes from Argentina, from South America. Mm-hmm. He understands the global South, and he has a vision of the world which is not that of the Western countries. And secondly, he turned definitively the page of the Cold War. And thirdly, last but not least, he's a Jesuit, as for example, Matteo Ricci, one of the most important figures in the church who came in the 16th century to China. His tomb is still in Beijing. He loved and respected China as this Jesuit Pope.
I see, Francisco. Very interesting point making there. So on the side of the Vatican, it seems that you know, we are seeing the right signs, the right development. What about Francesco on the side of China? We also see some new messages. For instance, China for the first time allowed the Pope to fly over China's airspace, which made it possible for the Pope to send a message to the Chinese people just a couple of years ago. How do you see the willingness on the Chinese side to further improve relations?
I think there is a greater determination, and also Xi Jinping wants to make a difference. It seems clear to me. Again, he didn't talk to me, but there is greater determination. He understands. I think he is the first leader to fully understand the influence of the church. Before, previous Chinese leaders before him understood the importance of the church within China. There are Catholics, there are millions of Catholics, they are good people. How can we improve their living, their freedom of faith and belief? he understands the global importance, the global influence of the church, and as he is projecting China in a different direction, on a different track, he understands that on this path, the church can help China achieving a better global role. And this is, I think, a vision of great importance for the future centuries of China, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the key stumbling issues, maybe structural issues facing the improvement of bilateral ties between these two countries is how do you deal with the relationship between the state and the church, which is still at an impasse here. So, Mr. Scaramuzzi, do you see the art diplomacy we are seeing here a viable shortcut, maybe to find, you know, another venue to improve ties without really getting stuck at any structural problems here?
I think that it's exactly the point. Art is universal. Art can build a bridge where politics is not yet able to build. And culture is an important point of meeting between China and the Catholic Church. In the interview you mentioned that the Pope gave to Professor Sisi, the Pope said the Catholic Church can receive culture. So the Catholic Church doesn't want just to bring something to China, it thinks that it can learn a lot from China. And the cultural venue is a preferential venue.
Okay, we have to leave it there. We're running out of time. Thanks anyway. Thanks very much to both gentlemen, Mr. Jacopo Scaramuzzi, journalist, and our old friend Francesco Sisi at the Center for European Studies of China's Renmin University. And here's my last point. Now, looking ahead, how to improve the relationship between China and the Holy See will still require political wisdom from both sides, but there is room for optimism, as both sides have shown the humility and willingness to adapt with the times and explore new opportunities. The Pope, for instance, washed the feet of asylum seekers, male and female. He sent the message that abortion is forgivable. He apologized to gay people for the way they have been treated by the church. He endorsed the Big Bang Theory and evolution, and he appointed a woman as the head of the Vatican Museum. China has also sent signal that it has the will to improve ties with the Vatican to meet the spiritual need of Catholics in China. There are no reason to believe a breakthrough in bilateral ties is impossible, given the pragmatism, open-mindedness and wisdom on both sides. That is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.